Hello, and welcome back to Learn It from a Layman. I'm Carl Christensen, joined again by Cameron and Matt. And Tim, I can't be bothered with your nonsense, Cox.
We planned this before the podcast. That's all.
We never planned this. Okay, so today's subject will be attention. So the basics of attention, what attention means, how to increase attention, all the psychological parts of paying attention. So we're gonna dig in right away here. Now, I guess actually I should start with this. So if you've come to this podcast trying to figure out like how to increase attention span or if that's possible, I guess I need to get this out of the way quickly because the reality is that podcast listening statistics mirror what a lot of online media statistics show, that people don't pay attention for all that long. So turns out you need to stick around.
So if you tune out of this podcast, you're a hypocrite.
You need to stick around till the at least middle, if not end, to figure out what the steps are to increase productivity and attention span.
Just listen to our ADHD podcast.
It's a good one. It's related, but this should be good. All right. So attention, as defined by our old trusty Wikipedia, is the behavioral and cognitive process of selectively concentrating on a discrete aspect of information, whether considered subjective or objective, while ignoring other perceivable information. So in the layman's terms, I guess you say it's literally what you generally mean when you say pay attention. Means don't have your thoughts elsewhere, don't have your senses focused elsewhere. Apply your cognitive processes to the task at hand. William James, who apparently was a psychologist in the late 19th century, wrote that attention is the taking possession by the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seem several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. Focalization, concentration of consciousness are of its essence. So once again, the idea just that we are capable of taking the sensory information that we're given and doing something specific, task-based with it, and that's kind of the idea of paying attention to something. So I already mentioned podcast listening statistics kind of show that. So you clicked on this podcast with the idea of a particular outcome or something that you're trying to learn or achieve, or maybe background noise. But the average podcast listen is somewhere between 4 and 8 minutes. So you can tell that's kind of representative of the idea that our attention span is limited. Our ability to control our minds in the way that we can apply it to a particular task comes up against temporal constraints. And so once again, I think a lot of people out there in the world are familiar with this idea that, like, as the internet and social media has developed over the last decade or decades, you've got video length getting shorter and shorter, right? That we obviously still have feature length movies, but used to be a TV episode was pretty standard, but now people like to go on YouTube and watch something for 4 or 5 minutes, and sometimes that's even too long. Now we need a TikTok, which is over in 10 seconds or whatever. And so that's representative of attention span constraints, but we'll talk a little bit more here in a few minutes about some conflicting information that the scientists have done studies that have conflicting information on whether or not our attention span as humans has actually decreased or not.
And is it bad one way or another, or is this just an adaptation?
Right, and that's the question, and that's, I guess, spoiler for one of our topics here later is that it's not entirely clear. There are statistics that we'll talk about kind of on both sides of that. But let's do a couple other kind of background definition of what we mean when we talk about attention, because I think it is important that we define this closely, because kind of your colloquial idea of attention might not, the more that we can define these things with terms, the better we can understand what we're talking about and how to improve attention span, or whether that is even something that makes sense. So in the research, the psychology research that I was looking into, they defined two different types of attention orienting. Orienting is that the task, the cognitive task of using your senses in a particular way. There's overt orienting. It says the act of selectively attending to an item or location over others by moving the eyes to point in that direction.
Random question. What is the currency that we use to pay for attention or pay to attention?
Oh, right. Like, how do we measure it? That's a good question. And
because you say pay attention because that means it's a transaction, right?
No, but whether or not there is one of the last questions I asked was whether or not the idea that can you actually increase attention? Is it just an on or off button? So we'll come back to that. But overt orienting is generally what we mean when when Tim tells his students pay attention. He means look at me, direct your ears this way. These things are overt, meaning like you do it in a way that can be, you're pointing your senses in that direction, as opposed to covert orienting is the act of mentally shifting one's focus without moving one's eyes. And so that's the idea that, okay, I'm listening to me, you're listening to me right now, right? Or maybe you're not, right? Maybe I'm background noise. And so if I suddenly grab your attention by saying something silly, or something relevant, or something loud, all of a sudden you're covertly changing your attention. You've been listening to me this whole time, but all of a sudden I've grabbed your mental process, and it's now paying attention to what I'm saying. So those are two different ways of orienting your attention. Now, in a relatively related definition, but different process, there's what psychologists call exogenous versus endogenous orienting. So exogenous is the idea that something grabbed your attention, something external to you, right? Something outside of your process, your mental process, is the thing that all of a sudden it's a reflex, an automatic. So if I'm driving along and some child runs out into the street, they've got my attention, right? Boom. And anything sudden, anything loud, something like that will all of a sudden grab our attention. Endogenous meaning something internally. I have decided that something goal-oriented, something task-oriented is all of a sudden I've taken my sensory information and I've now decided to direct it in one particular way. So those are related to overt versus covert orienting, but slightly different ways of understanding the way that attention gets directed by our cognitive process. Questions, Matt?
So is it really just eyes that distinguish between overt and covert?
I don't think so. Like I said, the example of like if Tim shouted something right now, then your auditory attention would be all of a sudden shifted, and so the idea of overt and covert, the definitions I read did specifically mention eyes, but the idea that you can listen to something in the background and then you can tune into it, seems like that difference as well. So I don't know.
There's a high correlation between what you are tuned into with your attention and where your eyes are, but they're not the same. It's just that the eyes are usually, our most active uh, source of sensory input. And so the eyes usually, I mean, that's with my students in my classroom. I'll always tell them, I'll wait until everyone's eyes are on me, because I know that if their eyes are somewhere else, then likely their attention is somewhere else, even though it doesn't technically have to be. So,
Right.
And,
Yeah. So I think, Matt, that's a psychologist could some doctorate in psychology could probably come on here and tell me or tell us exactly what that if that's the case, but in what I read, it mentioned eyes specifically, but I'd imagine that it could mean just senses, the active shifting your senses.
Okay, that makes sense.
All right. So there are different types of attention as defined by psychology. So I'm going to give you the definition of these various types. So there's 6 types of attention. There's arousal, which refers to our activation level and level of alertness. So that's whether or not you're tired, feeling energetic, that type of thing. So that's your arousal level, whether or not that's that type of attention. There's focused attention, which refers to our ability to focus attention on a particular stimulus. Sustained attention, the ability to attend to a stimulus or activity for over a long period of time. Selective attention, the ability to attend to a specific stimulus or activity in the presence of other distracting stimuli. Alternating attention, the ability to change focused attention between 2 or more stimuli. And divided attention, the ability to attend to different stimuli or attention at the same time. So we'll revisit some of these a little bit. Some of the other questions we were going to discuss here in the podcast kind of go on the topics of these various definitions of the different types of attention as defined by psychology. So let's move to the question of what's actually happening in your brain when you go from just passively listening to a podcast versus actively listening, or staring blankly into the distance versus actually focusing on what's in front of you. So there's a bunch of neuroimaging that's been done over the last 70 years. And as technology obviously has improved, they've been able to understand more and more about what's happening in your mind with particular neurons and particular areas of your brain when you're paying attention to a visual stimulus or an auditory stimulus. And essentially, it comes down to this: it says a growing body of neuroimaging research has identified a frontal parietal attention network, which appears to be responsible for control of attention. So there's a network of neurons in your brain which are in charge of what you're paying attention to. And so there are scientific ways to be able to essentially tell whether or not you are actively attending to a particular stimulus. Let's talk a little bit about. So there are these big headlines, I guess. What was it now? 5 or 6 years ago, about a goldfish attention span versus a human attention span, and goldfish get this really bad rap. Of having a really bad attention span, bad memory. I guess the layman generally talks about it as memory instead of attention span, but in this case, the psychology research and this got crossed over into the mainstream media, talked about how goldfish attention spans actually exceeded the attention span of a human, and how that had been a change from even 15 years earlier. So they did some research in 2015 that demonstrated, and we'll talk through about how they demonstrated, but demonstrated that the human's attention span was somewhere between 8 and 9 seconds, and that a goldfish's attention span was, I believe, 12 seconds.
They don't have us by much.
Yeah, we're getting there. We're coming at you, goldfish. It turns out we're going the wrong way. The research also said that we had lost a percentage of our the study group had lost some of their attention span over the course of 15 years. something like 20-25%. If I can look up these numbers exactly. Oh yeah, here it is. According to a study done in the early 2000s, the average attention span of humans decreased from 12 seconds to 8 seconds. And so thus we are now, the goldfish have 9-second attention spans. So I got some of those numbers confused. Goldfish have 9-second attention spans. We now have 8-second attention spans, we being humanity, at least allegedly, and whereas we used to have 12-second attention spans. Yeah, well,
does it tell you what a dog's attention span is, out of curiosity?
Well, so some of the issues concerning this is, how do you actually measure an animal's attention span, and what does that even mean? And the idea that humans can only pay attention to something for 8 seconds seems belied by reality. Like, in reality, if you're listening to me still now, and some of you still are, you've now been listening well over 8 seconds. And so what does that even mean, 8-second attention span? So that's when you got, let me see if I can find the what exactly, they measured, first of all, these are Canadians. So, I mean, is enough said?
I thought you really wanted that that Yukon audience here.
All right. Well, they're not listening anyway. So, but yeah, they were measuring some Canadians, and they were measuring Canadians like website views or something like that. It was not exactly your the way that most psychologists would measure attention span, and additionally, the way that you measure a goldfish attention span is under some debate. If the goldfish is paying attention to you, how do you know that? Are they staring at you? And does that mean they're paying attention? So the idea that this study had actually identified the fact that human had lost the attention span, and now we are outranked by goldfish, is a bit probably fallacious. It's not the case that our attention spans are only 8 seconds. Most psychology research that I was able to find said that so as we know, generally younger children do have a shorter attention span, and it increases throughout your teenage years until you're an adult. So some kind of general guideline for attention spans for different age ranges is 2-year-olds have 4 to 6 minute attention span, 3-year-olds 6 to 8 minutes, and then all the way up until you're about, they say somewhere after 16, 17 years old, your attention span kind of mirrors that of an average adult, and that's somewhere between half an hour to 50 minutes. That said, so I found those ranges in a couple different places, but I also found studies and psychologists that said, look, the reality is the maximum attention span for adults is 20 minutes. So all that is to say, it's unclear exactly in the research and the articles that I read whether or not we're even measuring the same thing. Does attention span mean the ability to focus solely on one task? Does it mean the ability to focus on that task while other stimuli are around you? Does it mean your desire to focus on that one's task? Anyway, there's a whole variety of ways to interpret this. So the idea that a particular attention span can be identified for all of humans and that it's less than that of a goldfish, I refuse to believe it, with the exception of Tim.
For me, yeah, that's right. Sorry, I was just going to ask what we're talking about, because about 8 seconds in, anyways.
Yeah.
For me, the interesting thing in this article is not necessarily the comparison to the goldfish. I think you pointed out that there's a lot of question marks. I think the interesting thing is that if this study was well done, and under the same conditions over time, the decrease and what that means. I'm not, I don't know, maybe we're going to talk about this later. I'm not as like amped up about how terrible the world is now that people aren't paying attention as much. I think there are problems, but I think a lot of it is context based and situational. You know, people have poor attention spans until they need to have good attention spans, and then they do what's needed. But it is still frustrating sometimes as a teacher.
Yeah, it is the case
So,
that
I mean,
society. Okay, yeah, go ahead, Cameron.
I was going to say, could this be like, I mean, obviously people are listening to the podcast right now. They have been for the last, 20 minutes, 10 minutes. But is it like, when we're paying attention, is it, okay, I'm focused, straight thought, that resets then my attention span,
Right,
whatever
and
that is?
Right, exactly. And that's the question, right? Is that what we're measuring here? Because generally that's not the case, right? Like, if we're saying that according to most psychologists, our attention span is, somewhere between 20 minutes and half an hour for an adult. I don't know how you even measure whether or not I had a stray thought in the middle of a 20-minute or 30-minute lecture. Like, even your best neuroimaging equipment out there isn't going to be able to tell that for a split second I thought, what's for lunch? So, that's there are tasks, obviously.
You push a button, you raise your
Right.
hand. I don't know.
There are tasks, and I guess I shouldn't underestimate the ability of psychology to get these things, pretty well nailed down. But the general understanding and the desire, I think, of the layman to know what attention means and how to increase your attention span probably doesn't go to the level of like, yeah, did I have a straight thought? It's more like, how do I stay focused and on task over the course of some time, when there are potential things that could otherwise engage my attention, not like, oh, can I literally do this single task without doing anything else for 20 minutes. So, okay. But as Tim touched on, so screens and the way that we interact with media and people and are culture based to some degree. And there were some studies that showed that like different cultures really do have a big impact on what the degree to which people can pay attention. The way people multitask is very cultural. And we'll talk a little bit more about multitasking here in a second. And so if that's your question as to, can I multitask? Is that something is that a good choice? Or how is that working? How is that affecting me? Well, that's something we're going to talk about here in a second. But screens and culture, so as screens have become ubiquitous with phones and tablets and all the other ways that we interact with digital media, obviously what we've talked about already with YouTube and TikTok and the idea that the media is becoming shorter and more, I would say more focused, but I don't know if that's the right word. It's becoming succinct, a tweet as opposed to an essay, right? It does change the way that we kind of interact with each other and we interact with society, but the idea that it's biological versus cultural based, that doesn't seem to be backed up by a lot of research, at least not yet. So I do have some statistics with it. Go ahead.
I was going to ask, what do you mean by biological versus cultural based? Like, because when you dig into psychology, there is biology there.
Absolutely.
If my mental habits have, wired the neurons in my brain in such a way that it is more difficult for me to pay attention to, say, a sustained conversation on physics or civics or whatever, then there's a biological underpinning to why I can't pay attention as well, right?
That is true. Yeah. And I guess, what I mean when I say biology, it's that it's not the case that our species has evolved away from attention spans. We can certainly wire our brains in particular ways that it does make it more difficult to focus and to pay attention for a particular amount of time. So that is true. That biology that biological underpinning, that understanding of how our minds are wired. I mean, we've talked about that in the podcast in past episodes. But the idea that we can't rewire it and that we come pre-wired in order to fail as far as attention span, I don't think that has been shown. It's just cultural as far as the way that we get wired is the way that society wires us, if that makes sense, as opposed to a biological predisposition to not be able to focus. Now that might be ADHD.
That doesn't make sense.
Yeah. So let me talk a few statistics, which says we are easily distracted. It says an office worker on average will check their email inbox 30 times every hour. That's a lot. The average user picks up their phone more than 1,500 times a week, taking on average up to 3 hours and 16 minutes a day. Average web page users will read at most 28% of the words during an average visit. And the average page visit for a website is 10 to 20 seconds. So we can't, the way that we interact with our digital media, and therefore, and because that's so big, ubiquitous now, it's becoming, I'm sure it's crossing over into the classroom, like Tim has to deal with it. It's certainly crossing over into where parents have to deal with it, is that we expect things to be consumable in a very small amount of time. Well, and then that eventually translates, like Tim said, into some biological wiring in our brain that's like, okay, well, if it's not inside this amount of time, I'm going to struggle with it. And that is, like I said, we're going to talk here at the end about ways that you can improve that. But it is the case that that is the way that society kind of interacts right now with information outside of you. So as you take this sensory information in, you expect in today's culture, at least American culture, and I think a large degree across the world, to be able to interact with it very quickly. And you want quick stimulus from lots of different locations. Tim, have you seen that in school? You've been teaching now for what, 100 years?
It feels like that, especially on the last day of the week. But yes, I mean, and I'm going to adopt for a second a slightly contrarian view because I don't know, I get a lot of in my professional community that moaning about how bad things are compared to how they used to be. And I feel like sometimes we get a little out of hand with it. I think we need to be frank, but I think we need to also recognize that at every juncture in our history where new technology has been introduced, especially information and intellectually oriented technology, it's caused shifts in how society functioned. And that goes all the way back to the introduction of writing, the introduction of movable type and print. These things drastically altered how information was passed. It changed memory, and anyone old enough to remember the time before cell phones has lived this in person. I used to have lots of phone numbers memorized because you would just need to call people wherever you went. You call your best friend, you call your parents, call your grandparents. Now I have, I think, my phone number and my wife's phone number memorized, and that's it. Technology is altered, and some could look at that and say, what a terrible world now. I think people are totally dependent on their phones and whatnot. But I think just like how, so anyways, my point is that society didn't fall apart when printing changed how information was passed, and I don't think society is going to fall apart with screens and how they're affecting information absorption and technology. But so I guess I'm just prefacing this by saying I'm an optimist. I don't think the world is falling apart, but I do think we are having some real problems. And I'm going to point out three, and then I'm sure we'll touch on some of them later. But I think the problem isn't that our attention spans are shorter. I think the problem is what happens because of our shortened attention spans. And one is in learning, where we have people who are less prepared to enrich themselves and to move towards goals because they, and I see this with students where they just don't have good study skills and independent study skills. So they're just going to be less equipped to move into the future. And again, I'm not as doom and gloom as some people, because I think what usually happens with a lot of these kids is they graduate high school, they find that they don't have the skill sets they need. They have to adapt. It's a bumpy road for a year or two, and then they figure things out and they go into the workforce and they're fine. So it's not a good thing, but I think we need to pause and take a deep breath sometimes as a society. That said, with my own daughters, I'm a total Nazi about these things because I want them to have the best experience. And so I am hyper attentive to their attention around screens and stuff. And every time they get on the screen, I have kind of an internal clock that just ticks. And before I'm going to yank it away and give them the boot and tell them to do something else. Okay, so that's a minor, well, it's not minor, it's a major problem, but I think compared to the next one, it's relatively minor. And the next problem is, I think, the effect that attention has on our psyches. And this is where we see problems in schools, and it is really getting, I think, pretty dire. The problem is not that kids have shorter attention spans. It's that because their attention spans are being gobbled up by lifeless screens, the quality of their interactions with people around them is diminished. So just on a overall basis, the teenagers of this year have weaker friend networks, weaker family networks, weaker mentor networks than they did, say, 20 years ago or 40 years ago. And we are seeing as a society an upswing in mood disorders, depression, anxiety, and eating disorders and other things that I think, and it's been noted, there's a lot of stuff out there written about it, that has really ramped up in tandem with the increase in technology, the introduction of smartphones and so forth. So I don't think that the poor attention spans that people have nowadays and kids have nowadays is itself the worst thing in the world. But the results of it, I think, are a big flashing red alarm. With teachers, we have suicide prevention training every year because we are seeing problems and we're trying to activate and respond, but it's just an uphill battle because all of these headwinds and what has our kids' attention is at the heart of it. So anyway, sorry, that was rambling. Questions or comments or directions you want to take with that?
Well, I was going to read some of the comments that I got from, so there's a Dr. Briggs. She's a psychology lecturer at Open University, and she's talking about the idea that attention spans are getting shorter, and she said that's plain wrong. She said, simply because I don't think that that's something that psychologists or people interested in attention would try and measure and quantify in that particular way. And she's talking in specific about this idea that goldfish have longer attention spans than humans. She says she studies attention in drivers and witnesses to crime, and says the idea of an average attention span is pretty meaningless. It's very much task dependent. How much attention we apply to a task will vary depending on what the task demand is. So
makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's lots of different ways that we could take this, but I was going to move on to one other topic here. Matt or Cameron, any other input on what Tim said?
No. I was going to summarize kind of what you just said with the lady, like about like the drive. Like if you think your average drive to work or whatever you do, there's parts where you just don't pay a lot of attention because maybe the traffic's a lot less, whatever, your traffic patterns if it's their usual standard, you don't pay as much attention versus if you're in heavy traffic or if there's like, inclement weather, your attention definitely increases to what's going on.
Right. And we're actually going to talk a little bit more about the driving situation here in a second. But yeah.
Okay.
So I guess a lot of people come, I said, and when I started thinking about doing this as the podcast, I was thinking, a lot of people are just interested in being able to focus for longer, or either for school or for work, or what affects attention and what's a good idea and not a good idea as far as being able to train yourself to pay attention or multitask. So let's talk about increasing attention span. One thing that I think a lot of people go to right away is either medication or some type of drug, because we've already done a podcast on ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. And so if you want more information about that, go listen to that podcast. But there are medications that help with that, right? Right, Cameron? Cameron, stop paying attention.
Yes. No.
Okay.
Took me a second to turn up.
You're good.
What I want is the limitless pill. That's what I want.
Oh, yes.
I was just thinking about that movie. Yeah, that documentary about Bradley Cooper.
Yes.
Exactly. And you can absorb that through blood. Like if you, okay, let's not get too graphic, I guess. There are portions of graphic violence in that movie. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so other than Ritalin, Adderall, those types of things, which you might think of right away, the more layman way to, I guess, increase attention, and in particular, where we talked earlier about arousal attention, one of the ways is your energy level, is with caffeine, right? So the question is, does caffeine effectively increase your attention as the layman would measure it, or does it decrease it? So let's talk some of the data here. It says it's been evaluated by a scientific organization in a significant number of studies and concluded that caffeine increases both selective attention and sustained attention. So it is the case that caffeine can be effective in increasing particular parts of attention. And so that way, you might succeed. So that, once again, selective attention is focusing on particular stimulus, and sustained attention is maintaining focused attention over an extended period of time. Here's where you got to watch out for it, right?
Well, I just wanted to pause and say that this podcast is brought to you by Pepsi and Coke products, as well as Folgers.
all of the above, yes. And Red Bull.
And Red Bull gives you weight and attention.
Right, the thing to watch out for caffeine is, says caffeine triggers the release of adrenaline, and adrenaline is the source of the fight or flight response, a survival mechanism that forces you to stand up and fight or run the hills when you're faced with a threat. So that mechanism sidesteps rational thinking in favor of a faster response. That's great if what you're trying to do is run faster or pay attention to running, but not when you're trying to compose a complicated essay or something like that. So you're putting your brain and body into a hyper aroused state, so you're getting that additional benefit in that way as far as attention is concerned. But emotional control and this adrenaline is causing issues with some potentially other brain functions. And something that in particular to pay attention to is the way that caffeine in fact affects sleep. And that's a huge part of being able to control your attention, it turns out, and being able to increase your attention span. I read that one of the biggest ways to be able to make sure that that your attention span is at a maximum is getting a sufficient amount of sleep at night. And those things are interrelated. If you have enough sleep, you'll be able to pay attention. But as you pay attention, you'll need more sleep. So caffeine can cause your body to get off your normal sleep schedule and therefore throw a wrench in your ability to pay attention at a particular interval of time. So caffeine has benefits and downsides. So just have to be very aware of your routine and be very careful. So that's caffeine. As comments?
Caffeine doesn't work like that for me.
Well, there are other ways to increase your attention span. So, and this is, you're listening once again. I'd imagine the most people listening to our podcast are doing it in a kind of multitasking environment. I'm sure there are some people that are sitting with rapt attention, but I'd imagine most of you are either driving or doing some other task while listening to a podcast. In that case, are you effectively listening to the podcast? Are you multitasking, meaning going back and forth between the listening to this and doing the other task that you are trying to achieve? And is this helping or hurting your attention span in general for either task that you're trying to accomplish? And so there are different things to consider with this as well. So listening to music or the dulcet tones of my voice might, and I guess in the case of my voice probably less so, give your body some type of a dopamine reaction. If you're listening to music, for example, that you like a lot, you'll get some it's the kind of pleasure hormone, the dopamine that's going to be potentially helping you actually focus at least for longer and being able to increase your productivity. However, if you're going back and forth, paying attention to the words of a song versus doing, writing the email that you're writing or whatever you might be doing for work, all of a sudden now you're hurting your productivity, right? This idea of multitasking is problematic when you think about the way that your mind will kind of go back and forth between the different tasks, the different inputs, the different sensory inputs that you're giving it. And so in order to increase productivity, you can try something like listening to music or radio or a podcast. You can try a fidget toy, something that will kind of give you some background noise. But when the fidget toy all of a sudden breaks, when all of a sudden you're staring at the fidget toy, when all of a sudden you've listened to the podcast and you forgot that you have not been writing your email for the last few minutes, you recognize that your attention has been diverted instead of aided in the task that you're trying to accomplish. So multitasking can be problematic in particular scenarios. So once again, you do have to take into consideration, though, the ability that you have to do a particular task for a particular amount of time, the demand that task gives. So that takes us to the idea of driving, like Cameron was talking about. So driving is one of those scenarios, and a lot of tasks in the normal life are the demand fluctuates. The amount of attention that you are required to give to a particular task fluctuates as the task progresses, right? Tim, when he's teaching, his the demand that he needs to pay attention to his class is at a peak level when he's the one standing in front of a class teaching, right? When Tim is now sitting down and the students are doing, desk work, Tim can fall asleep, right, Tim?
I can actually say that I have fallen asleep in front of my class while talking to them. It's really surreal, by the way. But yes, attention at its peak for sure.
Right.
I'm sure the parent reviews for that day were great.
Oh, no doubt. They're just kind of looking at me, because what you'll find is if you fall asleep while you're talking, is that your words start to kind of jumble and not make sense. So,
right. Now let's contrast. Right. So that's
that,
Tim,
or you're just not as good at teaching your foreign language as you think you are.
yeah, that's right. If that had been a Spanish class, that would have been fine. They'd be, oh, this guy's just improvising some Spanish. Oh, I don't know that word.
And And this must be a cultural thing, a siesta.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. Okay, so that's an example of different demands and tasks. Matt, when he it's all kinds of Matt, when you're in college and taking different variety of physics and math classes, I'm guessing some of these problems demand all of your attention for a significant amount of time, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, any difficult problem that you want to attack, you generally have to concentrate on. I don't know, are we going to talk about like concentration as a concept? Is that just a special kind of attention? Or
Right. And that was the last thing I was going to touch on because candidly, I didn't find a significant amount of research or data on, and maybe that's just my layman inability to look up the right thing. But yeah, the idea that can we measure concentration is if I'm concentrating on a calculus or a physics a test, how does that compare to the concentration that I'm giving, the email that I'm writing? Are they the same mental load?
It would be the same for me.
No, and I would add that it's probably task specific. You're using different parts of your brain for music, suppose for language or, I don't know, math and art,
Yeah.
so forth. So I'm sure it's somewhat task specific.
Right. So something that I've commented on the podcast in the past year is I had some exposure in college to cognitive modeling. And that's where something like this is very relevant. So the idea of cognitive modeling is to be able to create a computer program that will model cognition, the whole process of the brain, right? And various cognitive models handle the whole problem differently. But generally, there's this idea that there's a certain amount of finite resources, right? And that's obvious in reality. In biological reality, there's a certain amount of resources that you have, cognitive resources, and that as you are engaged in particular tasks, they take up more or less of these resources, right? So if I'm driving along and like Cameron said, I'm just cruising on the open road, probably very few of my resources are demanded at that time. So I can visit with the person sitting next to me, or I can text on my phone. Now, here's where the problem comes in, right? If I'm texting on my phone and all of a sudden that's taking a significant amount of my resources, right? My cognitive resources. And if all of a sudden something happens that suddenly demands a significant amount of my resources in this act of driving, I cannot shift quickly enough to be able to effectively manage the situation. And so I've now created this catastrophic situation because I was using my resources to do something else. And so the idea that there are a particular finite amount of resources and you need to appropriate them correctly is very well demonstrated in the case of driving. It's significantly less catastrophic, but something obviously the idea that if you're walking and talking and chewing gum, you have some of your resources are demanded with all of them. So these happen at different levels of potential outcome, fallout, but the idea that any task that you're doing are all demanding particular amounts of your attention. And so if I'm driving along, I need to be able to regulate my attention in a particular way such that attention can be given fully and completely to driving at a split second in when it matters. So and that's very different than the type of attention that we need to give to Tim when he's teaching, right?
Which, if you ask my students, is none at all.
It's not just your students, Tim.
I knew it. It's a conspiracy.
Okay, let's talk a few other ways that you can improve your attention. So multitasking, once again, I'd be very careful. I'd recommend this podcast and probably only this podcast as far as multitasking.
Absolutely.
Okay, but there are ways that you can, so your attention span, and like I said, depending on the way that you measure it, it's hard to quantify what exactly human attention span is. But generally, like I said, there's psychology books show particular ranges for adults, and so the idea that we can increase that with a particular with something like breaks. So taking breaks has been demonstrated in the research to be able to increase your productivity over the course of a couple hours. The idea that you can take 2 hours and just sit down and do one task, generally that's not the case. You are going to get distracted, and if you don't just schedule your breaks, take them and come back and get back on task, you're actually going to end up being less productive by just sitting there for 2 hours with your head in this problem versus 20 minutes, 5 minutes off, 20 minutes, 5 minutes off. At least that's what the data seem to suggest. So build in those breaks.
And make the breaks rewards. That's one thing I tell my students, because they're actively trying to build this. Give yourself some extrinsic motivation, in that when you get to that break, reward yourself with a piece of candy or a preferred activity that you enjoy. And anyways, I always encourage people trying to build their their ability in this area to think of it like your coach and your training. Your ability can be trained and strengthened and increased, but it just requires practice. And so people need to be patient with themselves, recognize that if you're feeling frustrated, that's okay. That's just part of the learning. You just keep going with that process you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess that's and this is, I think, what most laymen are most interested in. Is it possible to train yourself to be more productive, to have that attention span for longer? And the short answer is yes. To what degree? I wasn't entirely able to identify a particular number but the idea that, I can train myself to, okay, for 20 minutes, I'm, head down, I'm in this, for code for me. I'm in this, this is all I'm doing. And, in 20 minutes, I'm going to step away for a minute, come back and do it again. So the idea that you can train yourself to be able to do that effectively. If what you are, however, trained yourself to do is to just watch TikTok videos, your brain will have been trained to say, okay, I want 10 seconds. All right, we're done. 10 seconds. So.
Can I add to that, Carl?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, and I think part of what is happening is not only is your ability to attend improving, but your ability with whatever material or task you're working on increases. I remember when I went back to college to get my master's degree and having to read these really long and high level stuff. It was hard, and it was really difficult at first. And I noticed by the end of my program that I had gotten better at it. And I think part of it was probably, I was training my attention, but also part of it is my attention didn't need to work as hard to get through that task because I was better at it. I was better at reading that stuff, at writing. So, you'll find it if you have a real hard time paying attention in math because it's hard and it's boring and you want it to think about other things. Yeah, you can train your brain to work at it, and keep in mind, as you're training yourself in math, your brain is getting better at doing math, and it's getting more of that down, and it's a virtuous cycle. So, anyways.
Yeah, exactly. And so I guess one other thing that so there's something called mindfulness that in the research that I read about as well, and that's this ability to pay attention on command. And it says, I'm going to read the conclusion to this study. It says, although much remains to be studied, the current studies expand our understanding of the initial effects of brief meditation and suggest that brief meditation impacts attention even in novice practitioners. The fact that was revealed when controlling for other effects. So the idea that, training our mind in particular ways, and in this case it says brief meditation periods, are going to be able to give you that control. And like coming back to the original definition of attention, it's this ability to selectively concentrate on a particular piece of information. We're getting loads of information all the time, right? Go back to our memory podcast and the idea that visually you're getting a vast amount of information, and you are at most, selecting a small percentage of it to encode and be able to bring it into your brain. So that amount and the degree to which you pay attention to the surroundings, the sensory information that you are receiving, is something that you can work on, train, and improve. So I think that will be pretty much the end of the podcast. Matt or Cameron, any final insights as far as attention is concerned?
It's comforting to know that you can build your ability there.
Yeah. Comforting, and also it gives you a little bit of loathing to know that you I fail. TikTok videos are wonderful. So
it's frustrating to know that it's my fault. Dang it.
Exactly. Why can't I blame someone else?
Yeah. Hey, can I make one last comment? Just a challenge for our listeners.
Yes.
Okay. And this is on the topic of attention. I've noticed recently in my life that I am sometimes multitasking when I'm talking with my wife. And, I'm just on my phone, we're kind of chatting, and I'm kind of just scrolling through my notifications or articles or whatever I'm on. And I feel like it has a negative effect on our relationship. It's nothing dire. It's not like, it throws cold water on our relationship. But I think that that's something when I step back and look at it, I'm like, you know what? I could be a better husband, and I could be better in this relationship, and I could make our relationship better if I were giving her my full attention. I think not only for the quality of our conversation, I'm responding right away instead of after 3 seconds, I'm like, oh yeah. And then I respond. But also, I think, humans, we're so responsive and social that cues have meaning for us. And so when my wife is talking to me and I have my eyes on my phone and I'm just going, that's sending a message. And even if she is doing the same thing to me, we're sending each other that message. And I think it lowers the quality of our interaction. So my challenge for everyone, and this is something that I'm challenging myself to do as well, is to use your attention as a tool to improve the relationship with those you're closest to. Do you have a spouse, children, parents, siblings, roommates, friends, and I think use attention as a tool and send them that cue that they are the most important thing for your attention when you're with them, not your phone or whatever else.
Or in the case of me and Tim, you can use it as a cudgel. Did you say something, Tim?
That's right. I know you were just busy playing Angry Birds, weren't you?
All right. With that, thank you, Tim. And hopefully you've stuck around to the end of the podcast, because otherwise, what did you click on this podcast? But go back and listen to our ADHD podcast, and hopefully you can listen to the end of this podcast some other time. All right. Well, we'll be back again. We're coming up on our 100th episode of Learn It From a Layman, which is hard to believe. And somehow Tim has stuck around for all of them, or most of them.
That's attention, yes.
So we'll be doing a special 100th episode here in the not too distant future. But please share the podcast, like us on Facebook, and give us some reviews. Let us know what you think, and we'll be back next podcast. Thanks.